Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And welcome to episode 50. We wanted to save this episode for talking about a subject very near and dear to both of our hearts, music in video games.
Yeah, for those who don't know, before Autographs, I had on crashchords.com a very intense and very loved music review podcast where I would review an album with two co-hosts every week. And that was born out of my intense nerdery for music in general. And when I developed a love for gaming as a child, that grew as well. And we covered some video game soundtracks on that show, but not a ton. But one of the reasons I've been hesitant to take on this topic is, for one, I know both Geoff and I would be very long-winded about it, but also I wanted to make sure that we got it right because there's a lot of information about music and gaming. There's a lot of different composers, and while I can already promise some of these names I will butcher of these composers, I wanted to make sure that we were able to give it 110% and not just fly into this episode on the seat of our pants because there is a lot to talk about when it comes to music and gaming.
There is, and because depending upon when you are looking at games, the notion of a video game soundtrack can almost seem laughable or can only seem automatic. There is so many different approaches to music, even as far back as 1981 on Frogger for the arcade. Music in games wasn't just, we play this thing over and over. It's depending upon what you're doing, how you're doing, the music will play out differently. And so it's not necessarily as simple as just sitting back and putting on a record for listening to it or going to a concert for it, though those do exist.
Yeah, and what's really interesting also is some of my fondest memories of video game music are the early Nintendo days and the Atari days. And I think it's because part of it was there was no real other way to listen to video game music back then than to play said games. One of my fondest memories of Super Mario RPG on the Super Nintendo actually is there is a redone version of Bowser's theme from Super Mario Bros. 3 in Super Mario RPG. It's the first time you fight Bowser on the chandeliers in the opening of Mario RPG. And I really love that song so much that I used to just leave the Super Nintendo on that turn-based battle and let the music play so I could listen to it because it's the only time in the game you get to hear that song. And it's the only version of that song that I really loved. There were other versions, but that was the one. And it was before the days of the internet and streaming music and being able to download tons of music. I'm sure somewhere out there was a CD version of that soundtrack, but I didn't have it. And so, like, to listen to that song, I would just boot up a new save file of Super Mario RPG, get to that battle, and let it play.
Yeah, and it's very funny, too, that there are those tunes, songs, pieces in video game music that we absolutely would just let them play and play and play. And if you get them on a soundtrack format, it almost becomes hilarious when you realize that the loop of these songs is anywhere from 45 seconds to, I don't know, maybe 2 minutes. And when you put it on a soundtrack, it usually will maybe loop twice and then fade out.
Yeah.
I remember when I got Castlevania Portrait of Ruin for the Nintendo DS. That was the 20th anniversary of Castlevania, and it came with a CD. And it had something like 55 tracks on it because you could, maybe it's more like 40-something, because you could fit that much on a CD when they're only a minute and a half each.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at music from early games versus games now because I'm sure they're composed very differently too. And I think what's interesting about the old school Nintendo and Super Nintendo stuff is you're right. Like playing a game, you wouldn't pay attention necessarily so much to the loop. Like it takes me back to the Mega Man games and how much I loved, for example, Gemini Man's theme from the third game. It had this kind of salsa tone to it. And what's really interesting about it is like listening to it now on a soundtrack because Capcom released all of their music onto Spotify recently. It does. It only loops like twice, and it's not a long song. But when you're playing the Mega Man level, if the level takes you between 3 to 5 minutes, that in your brain makes you think what the length of the song is, because it's however long it took you to beat that stage is the length of that song, because that's
Yeah.
how long you heard it for.
And if you die a couple of times, you just think, oh, it's starting back at the beginning of it. So, it's, of course, a long song.
Right.
And they had to be catchy songs because you would die a lot.
Yeah, and I think also, one of the reasons I was hesitant to talk about music and gaming was only because I don't want to understate the impact of it. This idea that we take, I think at least, a lot of these soundtracks for granted, maybe less so now. Like a good example is I love the soundtrack for the Zelda games, and there have been so many great songs in all the Zelda games. Hell, we're getting a Zelda game on the Switch later this year that focuses on rhythm and music, from the creators of Crypt of the Necrodancer, and they're remixing a bunch of old songs. But I remember when we talked early on in the series about my biggest complaint about Breath of the Wild was that there really isn't any music in that game. And with good reason. They're trying to create this feeling of real life and like being out in nature, and like they wanted the music to be very low key and atmospheric. But that's not what I know Zelda games for. And so it was very strange for me, because there's this legacy of epic music that leads into these huge battles in all of these other games. And, Breath of the Wild had some of that, but definitely not to the same degree the previous games had. And it made the experience for me different. It was definitely noticeable.
I think that was a very, very intentional thing. As you mentioned, they definitely chose to, scale it back a little. And I think when you put in a Zelda title and you have that expectation of like, let me hear their variation on the overworld's theme. Let's get all epic and trumpety. And then you are waking up in the middle of you don't know where, and it's been 100 years since you were awake, and what has gone on, and you're alone in this world. The absence of music is just as powerful. And after over 30 years of a series and 40 years of games with music, those times when you choose to understate can be very, very powerful.
Yeah, for sure. My favorite thing when talking about music and media is to point out the iconic word scroll in Star Wars. Imagine if the Star Wars theme wasn't there. How boring that would be.
So boring.
The reason that opening cutscene is so epic in any video game incarnation or movie incarnation of Star Wars is because of that huge fanfare that John Williams created. It gets you so excited for the start of that adventure because it is just so powerful and blaring and uplifting.
Yeah, it even times out that the last paragraph comes in when the main theme kicks back in again.
Right.
They've got the melodic motions and the motifs timed out to the paragraph breaks. And for some reason, that just makes, reading the backstory. I am so pumped.
Right. And this idea that, I think a lot of games now in modern gaming rely on soundtracks to kind of do the same things that movies have done for years. I think early gaming, it's safe to say music wasn't used in the same way you would use it to score a movie, just because the ability to craft that kind of soundscape didn't exist yet. The sound devices on these small systems, the chips, were just not powerful enough to create the kind of epic sweeping stuff that we hear and see in games now.
Yeah, and it's a different there's a different aim in the older arcade games. Who knows how long your experience with the game will be? And for the most part, they just want to get more quarters. So the biggest, most dynamic sounding stuff is probably in the game's attract mode, where it's like, oh man, this looks amazing. Let me put a quarter in. There's almost no music when you play it. And you play it, you're brought in by the gameplay, you don't want to get distracted by it. Pac-Man doesn't really have a soundtrack. It kind of has a gameplay soundtrack. If you count, it's got a beat. But it also has introductory music that everybody knows. But that's the entire, that is almost the entire soundtrack. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, this idea that it just had those little intro themes, and then it was mostly just the sounds of the game.
Yeah, and Donkey Kong as well,
Yeah,
and games of that time. Not some games had music then, but not all.
yeah, and like talking about sound design, like you talking about Donkey Kong, I can hear Mario's jumping sound in my head as we talk about it.
Yeah.
Like
There,
it's a
yeah,
familiar tone.
yeah, there is a little bit of music. It's just not like when you think of, oh, there's a game with Mario in it. The music is very tame and very, unintrusive. I'm sorry. Are we playing the same Mario game?
Yeah, I think it's the later arcade games that had a more diverse soundtrack, and I think those were influenced by the consoles because you think about all of the early to mid Nintendo games, and like even Super Mario Brothers or the original Zelda both had pervasive music. I mean, we talked earlier about the Overworld theme, which is a Zelda song that you would assume most people who are even peripheral to gaming would know that song. Or, of course, almost everybody knows the Super Mario Brothers theme. I recently hosted a burlesque show that was video game themed, and one of the performers mixed a musical with the music from Super Mario Brothers. And like, even if you don't know everything that's going on, you will absolutely recognize the Super Mario Brothers music because everyone knows the first game's music.
Yeah, and all the parts of the soundtrack. And because there are a couple of different tunes, but there's a couple of different kinds of levels. If it's underwater, it's this. If it's underground, it's this. If it's overworld, it's this. If it's castle, it's that.
Yeah, but otherwise those were just the tones.
Right, and they were designed in such a way that they are very dynamic and very interesting. And there is a lot of credit that needs to go to Koji Kondo for their composition of the Mario soundtrack and sort of setting a lot of standards, because you think about like, man, why is Mario music so catchy? And you try to learn it and you realize that it is jazzy as all hell.
Yeah.
It is jazzy as a cat in a trumpet case with a fedora on it. with I don't know, an unnamed glass next to it and everything. No, I'm sorry, but it is jazzy as all get out, and the rhythm and the beats of that, because you only had 4 voices, if I'm not mistaken. The NES chip had a few extra voices, but they were very specialized for giving a dynamic soundtrack. And so having things sort of be off the beat and work a little bit here and there, you made a lot of things happen at once. Or even the fact that the underwater music of Super Mario Brothers sort of set the tone that underwater music is a waltz.
Yeah, and they've always done that, because even if you think later in Super Mario 64, it does have this kind of flowy, waltzy tone to it. It's a little more subdued than the first game's water music, but they kind of keep that motif through all of the Mario games.
Yeah, and it's sort of, it lends it a floaty and sometimes atmospheric edge. Soundtrack for Donkey Kong Country and Donkey Kong Country 2, the underwater music may not necessarily be in 3, but there is a lot of extended harmonies that go on in there, and there's a lot of extra bits that almost make it seem very floaty while also very exciting in its way.
Yeah, that's something interesting about composing for video games, I must assume, that was different than composing for movies, at least in the early days of gaming, is that you had to really fit the music to the theme of the game. I guess that's not that different from film, but it's compartmentalized maybe in a bit of a different way. And you also think about, even later on, all of the composers who are creating for later games that had more expansive soundtracks, I think there's still this need to understand the source material and create a vibe that, people will latch onto.
Yeah, it definitely creates a lasting impression. It is another, tool, another color in creating the general idea of what's going on. Speaking of older tunes that are very repetitive, one of my favorite NES games is Bubble Bobble, and that has one tune. It has an intro before you go into the first level, and then from levels 1 all the way up till the very final level when it changes, it is the same loop, just going. It's just shy of 2 minutes, and it will go and go. And I have played so much Bubble Bobble, and I still love that music. And it is all kinds of bouncy and fun while you are a little dinosaur that shoots bubbles and fights all these monsters. And it's a really difficult game, but it's, the music's like very, very jumpy, very, very peppy, very fun. And that creates a atmosphere and an idea of like all the caves are different colors and look at all these enemies and I'm just shooting bubbles and I found all these cool power-ups. And there's just something about it, whether it's a matter of those sorts of games, you get very caught up in what you're doing, so you're not even paying attention to the music anymore, and you come back to it and realize it's there and it just sort of becomes part of the background, or not. But it's funny to see how their songs and their tunes they're eminently forgettable, and then other ones that are incessant, memorable, and never go out of style in a way. It's kind of a funny thing.
Well, sure. I mean, and Bubble Bobble, of course, influenced by the puzzle game Bust a Move and those characters. And, the idea of creating music for puzzle games, I think, is also very interesting because you take Tetris, which originally had 3 different themes. One of them is definitely more famous than the other 2 just because it tends to recur. Like, they created the soundtrack that was catchy, that was interesting to listen to, but they wanted you to be focusing on the puzzle solving part and not the music part.
Right. And they actually digitized a folk song for that one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Korobeniki.
Oh,
The iconic Tetris music is in fact a 19th century Russian folk song.
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, it was that Tetris is a whole host of ridiculous rights issues and licensing and everything getting sent all back and forth. Honestly, doing a public domain piece of music for the soundtrack is probably eases those transitions of selling this at the time Soviet product outside of the Soviet Union in several different markets.
That makes sense, yeah.
And so now it's hilarious when there are concerts or places that people are very seriously playing Korobeniki. I know I'm butchering the name. I'm very sorry. And people go like, "Oh man, they're playing video game music." No, they're playing music that happens to be in a video game. In fact, the original Zelda Overworld theme was supposed to be a pre-existing piece of music. It was supposed to be a bolero.
Oh, wow.
And I believe it was Bolero by Maurice Ravel that they were going to use. And they last minute got I don't remember whether this was precisely they had to change it or it was just like, could you please not? And they went like, well, phooey. Guess we got to come up with an overworld theme. We ship very soon. And so if you listen to Bolero, it's not as if they're exactly the same or they only changed a few notes, but you see where they got the feeling for what eventually became the overworld music for Zelda, what originally became one of the more iconic pieces of classic video game music was because they weren't allowed to use an already existing track.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's something interesting too about music and gaming is that we don't really think about that kind of licensing thing and the idea that certain composers might have to license other works depending on what they're working towards. I mean, I know for a fact that a lot of the composers of the Star Wars video game stuff were not only adapting John Williams stuff for those games, but also creating their own stuff and the like that wasn't John Williams per se, but was inspired by.
Yeah, they had shoulders to stand on as they built their own distinct tracks, their own distinct things, and that's perfectly fine. Art is a collaborative and evolving thing. Genres in games and gameplay ideas come about because we ape and evolve and develop. It's one thing to completely just go, all right, this is this now, but musical ideas come and go and shift and change. There was a sort of vogue or sort of period in NES music where the harmonic motion of several songs is it's the tonic, flat 6, flat 7, 1. This happens a lot in Mega Man music. This happens in Mario. That is in fact the harmonic motion of the end of level. You've gone down the the flagon into the castle before the fireworks happen. That is the harmonic motion of the Final Fantasy victory music. And it is very triumphant, and if you play it right, it has a very rock music kind of feel, which was a great way for making rock-sounding music with more primitive sound chips. So, although speaking of sound chips, Matt, what is your favorite console's characteristic sound?
Oh, that's tough. It's tough for me because my favorite soundtracks come from different places, and different composers too, And it's funny, I didn't think on some of the soundtracks and how the sounds were different until I really went back as an adult and listened to them, because they were very different. You take the sound chip in the Sega Genesis that produced the Sonic music versus the sound chip in the Nintendo or the Super Nintendo. Like, they all have their distinct characteristics.
Exactly.
And I don't know that a favorite. That's tough. I think for me, I'll always go back to the Super Nintendo, just because I feel like the music diversity on the Super Nintendo was greater than any of the other consoles of that early generation. Because you could not only have a game like Super Mario RPG or Super Mario World or Yoshi's Island, but then you also had games like Donkey Kong Country. The music that David Wise did for Donkey Kong Country is kind of unlike anything else that was out at that time, or even to come after. It's why they brought him back for the more recent Donkey Kong Country games. Like, it's just so unique, and they pushed both the graphics and the sound of the Super Nintendo so far with that game that it was kind of unlike anything that came before it.
Yeah, it's always very cool to see when a composer really uses a sound chip for all that it's worth.
Yeah.
The Silver Surfer game for the NES is rather infamous for being a horrible, terrible, horrible, no good, very bad game.
Yeah.
But the soundtrack, oh man, the soundtrack.
Yeah, that's one of those games where the soundtrack outlived the game, because I owned that game, and it was in fact quite terrible. It was impossible to beat without Game Genie. Incredibly difficult and janky, but the music was super memorable and probably one of the reasons I always went back to it.
Yeah, and it can really make a game feel more epic, more interesting. I'm just not the game's not bad. I'm just not good enough at it yet. While you're sitting there with a soundtrack that, again, there were very limited voices on the NES sound chip, but by having one track do the work of several instruments and just have all of their notes playing on slightly different beats, you can make a very full-sounding piece of music. And the title screen is awesome, but the first level music is suitably amazing. I don't know any of the other levels. You don't need to know any of the other levels. That's the only level you're going to see.
Right.
And it's definitely shown up in other works, in fan games, in videos, and all kinds of stuff. And I'm sure for a lot of people, it's very much divorced from the experience of playing the game. But the track, it's so good.
Yeah, and it's funny, you asked me what my favorite sound chip was, and I'm going to bring that question back to you in a minute. But I think also one of the more revered sound chips just in the music industry is the Game Boy, because a lot of 8-bit music makers use the Game Boy to create music because of the diversity of sound that the Game Boy sound chip had.
It was certainly for the fact that it wasn't the most powerful, it's not the most diverse, but it is portable. It is very straightforward, and that allows you to introduce a lot of nuance, and it is very powerful for what it is. I mean, any chip music that I have made on my Game Boy. I mean, our podcast's music was a track that I composed on the Game Boy.
Right, which I don't know that we've actually ever said on the air, that you composed our theme music.
And it was just something I was goofing around with, and I really liked it. And I'm like, what am I going to do with this? Oh, we're starting a podcast? Perfect.
Right, exactly. But do you have a favorite sound chip in early console gaming?
Sort of. I'm very much in that same boat of I like a lot of different games. I like a lot of different soundtracks. Probably my favorite sound chip looking back is the Sega Genesis sound chip. And I did not grow up with the Sega Genesis. So this is more of coming back to it later in getting to play Sega Genesis collection games or acquiring a Sega Genesis for my collection, where there is a definite characteristic quality about that FM chip that I don't know exactly what to call it, but other chips couldn't make quite the sounds that the Genesis did. And a lot of Genesis composers leaned into that and making a very, because the Genesis wasn't quite as powerful as the Super Nintendo. It wasn't quite, there was a lot of things where advertising did a lot of good work for Sega Genesis. Not that it was a bad system, not by any stretch of the imagination. And Nintendo and other companies have proven that power doesn't mean everything. But Genesis thrived on its idiosyncratic identity. And so the Sega Genesis chip has just a very unique quality that I very much enjoy. And in discovering new Sega Genesis games for myself, it's very delightful to get to hear the soundtracks. Even the bad ones, they sound so utterly Genesis.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, thinking about the Genesis, I did praise the Super Nintendo, and I'm going to go back to that in a bit. But the Genesis, think about the jump between Sonic 1, Sonic 2, and Sonic 3. Like, especially if you compare Sonic 3 and Knuckles to Sonic 1, the music is completely different, except for certain overlap. Like, the Angel Island theme is this Caribbean steel drummy sound that, I don't think they could have imagined doing for the first game. There's so much pop music influence in the third game. Of course, the rumor that Michael Jackson had helped compose it, which I don't know that was ever confirmed or not.
I think it's been confirmed. And I mean that confirmed with a question mark. Certainly his influence is there.
Right. But, like, the fact that there's so much pop music influence in that third game, regardless of who helped compose it, is so apparent, and it's because they just decided to use the Sega sound chip in a different way. It wasn't that they weren't capable of doing that sound. It was just they had to do it a certain way to achieve that sound. And it's that kind of composition that I feel like doesn't really exist anymore, because with most modern gaming, you can use orchestrated music. There's no need for MIDI tone-based music anymore.
Right. The challenge has shifted.
Right.
And which is why the idea of chiptunes is such a thing now, where after CD-based gaming in particular became a thing, it was mostly, well, we can compose what we want, put it on the CD, and the game will play it back. But you can look at the NES, the Game Boy, the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo to a lesser extent. The Commodore 64 also has a very strong chiptune community. But given that I didn't grow up with a Commodore 64, and I don't think you did either, Matt.
No.
So neither one of us can speak intelligently or with authority about the Commodore 64 experience. If one makes its way into my life, I will goof around like crazy with it. But there is definitely a C64 chiptune community as well, where people have made tracker software, which allows you to compose tracks and sort of manipulate the sound chip as you need. One of the easy ones to find, say for Game Boy, the one that I use is Little Sound DJ, LSDJ, that you can actually download a ROM for free and play on an emulator. And in no way are you doing anything illegal because it's not licensed software.
Right.
Which is kind of fun. And it is an excellent community, and it's great to see that still decades later, people are getting all kinds of fun things out of the chips, out of what these pieces of software and hardware could do. And because they don't have to also use hardware space, RAM or anything like that to run a game or run graphics or run anything else. It's just we are devoting all of this to the music. You can compose some pretty crazy stuff.
Well, yeah, and I think before we go back to talking about music in gaming, I'd like to talk about music from gaming for a little bit, because I have a friend named Chris Kaiser who just put out a record, I think towards the end of last year, called Reviver, which is a chiptune record. And I had him as a guest on one of my other podcasts, and we were talking about his music. And he talked about how he likes video games and that he played games growing up, but he's not a big gamer now. He just likes the tools. And while I got a lot of sense of video game related stuff from his music based on where my head is at, he said that a lot of the influences for the music he composed is not necessarily video games. It's feels from other places, but he's not necessarily thinking of a video game when he composes this music. And it's really fascinating to me because, like, first of all, I love his record, but second of all, when I hear it, like, one of the tracks reminds me of Mass Effect, and one of the other tracks reminds me of Mario Brothers, and it's like that influence is coming from my experience, not what he was using to compose. It's just kind of a cause and effect that aren't necessarily related, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah. And it's very funny that we look at chiptunes, we look at video game music as its own genre when it in fact spans across all of them. It's just we are defining it by the tools used to create them, or perhaps the medium that they exist upon.
Sure. Or, and another thing to get music nerdy in a different direction, nerdcore is a fairly large and well-known sect of the rap community, and there are a ton of great musicians who have made a career. I mean, look at Mega Ran, who literally made a career of making music from Mega Man music, and he's grown beyond that now and uses all sorts of different stuff and has used all sorts of other gaming tunes and beyond to craft his beats. But in the early days, he was focused on Mega Man and created some incredible rap songs just using the bones of the 8-bit and 16-bit songs from the early games.
Yeah, there's a lot you can build on that.
And I always thought that was really fascinating. Or even one of my favorite rap songs, actually, which I've played for you, is called The Moon, which is a song done by Michael Kill, which is about reaching for the stars. But he samples the Moon theme from DuckTales for NES and then layers a beat with it, and it works so well. And he doesn't even change it that much. It's literally the initial tune with a heavy backbeat, and it makes for a perfect rap beat, which I thought was fascinating and has become one of my favorite songs.
Yeah, and also The Moon is a track with a very unique time signature to it. I want to make sure I'm getting it right. I think it's like 1716 or something like that. But I'm also thinking on far less, I guess, great, but certainly a memory of mine was one of the first like nerdcore songs I ever heard was DJ Chris. And I mean, a lot of people know his song about Boba Fett.
Oh, MC Chris, you mean?
MC Chris. Sorry, you're right. MC Chris and his track about the Fett's Vet. But he also had one that was called Robitussin. That the entire beat, almost the entirety of it, is the Gauntlet theme.
Right.
Like just the title screen music, and he raps on top of it. Sorry, the DuckTales Moon theme is in 15/8 time.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So trying to learn how to play those opening arpeggios and everything, it's a little odd.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of missing just a little bit of a beat, and where you subdivide by 4 creates a lot of motion and can create, because it's in 8, you can have long notes there and it's all within the 4, or a 4 within a 4 as it is. Getting very music heady on you, but I love it.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's really interesting about these musicians now that I've become fans of, that were clearly raised on some of the same music we were in the video game sphere, is the kind of creativity that you can birth from using such simple compositions. Some of them were very complicated even for the time, but some of them are not, but you can still build off them. And some of these songs are so iconic for the games that they represent, yet when reused for a rap song or a rock song, still invoke other things as well. Like there's a band called the Megas who make rock songs out of Mega Man music, and they play them on real instruments, physical instruments, but then they create songs usually having to do with the character that the music represents, but they create their own lyrics, they create their own story, as it were. And that's also really fascinating to me. They have a song called You Sparked a War, which is to the Sparkman theme, and it's all about like the raising in the ranks and like creating this army to stop Mega Man because it's from the perspective of Sparkman. It's just, or even we've talked, I believe, before on the show, at least once or twice, about the Proto Men and the rock operas they've created using Mega Man music, which is really amazing.
Yeah, they've created some insane stuff.
And it's fascinating where the source material comes from, and that at the time when we were kids, I would have never imagined this kind of music existing. And now, because of the accessibility of the internet and the ability to hear this stuff, even if you don't own those old consoles, you can create so much interesting stuff from these original pieces.
Right. Well, and since a lot of the older songs, because they had to be shorter, because they had to be catchy, I mean, because you never know when you're switching from one segment to the next, it needs to be a nice, smooth transition. And all of these tunes ended up having to be kind of hummable, kind of catchy in order for it to stick with you. And because of its simplicity, it allows for a great deal of development and evolution on them. And it also doesn't take a lot for them to be referenced within later games in the series, or to create the idea of a motif that will come back again and again. Every Zelda overworld theme doesn't necessarily have to sound exactly like the original, but there's just a few things you need to do, and it's a Zelda overworld theme again. And so a lot of different artists and people building off of them, they can take these little pieces, they can take these key bones. It's similar to, I think of it like paleontology and finding dinosaurs. A lot of dinosaurs we see in the museum are not complete skeletons. They look like complete skeletons, but it's all extrapolation.
Right.
If you see a giant long-necked dinosaur, a sauropod, they've maybe found 8% of that skeleton, and the rest of it is just building and building, but those few bones, they go, it is this, it must be that, and we have developed these. And we are all paleontologists digging up the bones of games of game soundtracks of yore, and people making amazing, badass dinosaurs out of them.
Yeah.
The metaphor got away from me here, but you know what I mean.
Yes. Yeah, I understood. Well, let's shift the conversation a little bit about talking about specific composers, because you were talking about motifs, and there are a few modern composers who I've become fans of that I didn't realize I was a fan of until much later. One of them is Grant Kirkhope, who is famously known for doing Donkey Kong 64, Perfect Dark, GoldenEye, recently doing ukulele. His biggest games, of course, the Banjo-Kazooie series, Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie. He did the Mario Rabbids game for the Switch as well, which then he's working with an existing very well-known music property to craft his own stuff, which was really interesting. He's always created, and the list goes on. I maybe mentioned a third of the games he's worked on. Mm-hmm. He did Grab by Ghoulies, Star Fox Adventures, Viva Pinata. The list goes on.
Yeah.
His sound has always had this really interesting flair to it, because he knows how to craft an upbeat narrative with music. And I think it's always, how to put it? He's always immersed you in the world he's in by creating a dearth of tones that kind of really suck you in, if that makes sense.
It does.
He's a composer who is not afraid to try new things, experiment, jump around. But at the end of the day, there's a through line that's very familiar to him that's got this kind of jazzy, upbeat, kind of poppy sound that really kind of gets you revved up. Like, I can hear the original theme for Banjo-Kazooie in my head as I'm talking about him because of the kind of things he crafted. Or even think about the stuff in GoldenEye. Like, there was music in every stage. A lot of it was influenced by the James Bond stuff of yore, but creating original tunes for the facility and some of these other multiplayer maps that became so iconic. And it's because of him knowing how to ride a beat, knowing how to compose to fit the mood of the space you were in, which is something that he's always been really good at.
Yeah, and it's an important thing to remember in composing for video games, in composing for anything. It's suit the game itself. What are you trying to do with this music? What do you want the players to feel? What do you want? What are you achieving with it? What do you want people to look at or not look at, kind of thing? And so, yeah, it can't be understated, or can't be overstated, rather, how important being able to suit the game is.
And also something worth mentioning is, because he was the composer of Donkey Kong 64, without Grant Kirkhope, we might not have the epic DK rap that we know and love today.
Right?
which
It's yeah.
it's a thing that lives in infamy on either side of the aisle.
It exists.
It does, but yeah, and it's just funny because it wasn't until recently Grant Kirkhope has appeared a lot on the Completionist YouTube series because the Completionist Gerard has become good friends with him. I've heard interviews with him talking about like the processes he's gone through to compose these themes and make music for these games, and I think it's always really interesting to get inside the head of a composer and figure out where they're coming from to make these games. Because I imagine also as technology gets better, composing for these games must get more challenging and less challenging at the same time. Less challenging because you have the freedom to do whatever you want, but probably just the same, more challenging because you can literally do anything. So what do you do?
Right. And it's interesting to see when some folks will make a niche out of certain areas or certain aspects or certain limitations. A composer that has been getting a lot of love the last few years, and deservedly so, is Jake Kaufman, otherwise known as Vert, who he's been professionally composing since around 2000, and before that was making remixes and rearrangements of video game music on Overclocked Remix and then his own site VG Mix, and he did the soundtrack for Shovel Knight. He has worked on the Shantae series. He has worked on, let me think. I mean, he's working on he is working on Bloodstained.
Right.
And he clearly has done a lot of, I don't want to say throwbacks, but certainly music that it doesn't need to be 100 some odd piece orchestras and big sweeping soundtracks. He's composing tight, catchy, powerful music that fits certain throwback aspects. He did the soundtrack for Double Dragon Neon, which was also sort of a revisit of Double Dragon. And you listen to the music and it's got full-on guitars, not, digitized guitars. It is rocking as all hell. And that's sort of that evolution of, well, that's what Double Dragon was trying to do anyway. So here it is. Whereas something like Shovel Knight is very restrained in that it can't, we've talked about this a lot, it can't actually be played on an NES. It's got too many colors and graphical ideas going on, but it feels like it should be. And Kaufman's music matches that and is just as catchy and epic and wild while also feeling as though, is this only 4 channels? It probably isn't, but it's amazing. And, anytime a new retro style game comes out and he's announced on the soundtrack, I feel like the anticipation on it goes up exponentially. It's very cool to see that.
Yeah, and the fact that he's creating within self-made limitations is always really interesting too. Like, you have to assume someone like Grant Kirkhope, for most modern games, is just creating however he wants because most sound cards now can handle just about anything. Whereas someone like Jake Kaufman is definitely self-limiting because he's like, all right, well, this game looks like a Nintendo or Super Nintendo game, so it should probably sound like that. It should all be MIDI sounds. It shouldn't be orchestral music. Although I think it would be kind of fun in a future Shovel Knight game to have like a sweeping orchestral like final theme to the game, even though the rest of it's been 8-bit.
That would be cool.
It would be very a fun dichotomy. But it's just interesting to me to see that people are doing that. It's not that different from me talking about Chris Kaiser earlier and how he's composing on 8 and 16-bit devices and making music that's sweeping, even though its base is still something so simple.
Yeah, and you certainly, in developing art, can find new and wild things in limiting yourself, either in limiting technology. I don't necessarily know how common, but I like using it. Technique in composing music is switch up your instrument.
Right.
If you've been either play an instrument that you're not very good at, or if you've been composing on one thing for a while, switch it up. Try to write what you're doing on something else you can play. And these are sort of limitations that force you to think a little differently. And trying to do that on a Game Boy tracker or the Fama tracker or any of those, you only have so many voices to get all of this out. So do.
Yeah. Well, when we talked about sound design in the past, some of these sound cards have done some interesting things, like with digitized voices. And,
Yes, sampling.
when we were talking about voice acting and the idea that some of that stuff has been incorporated kind of into music later on. Like, think about the Mortal Kombat soundtrack for the movie and how they used the digitized Test Your Might from the early arcades and video games, then in the music when the Immortals were remixing those songs to kind of give that feel of the old school video game.
Yeah, and there's a bit of back and forth, and there was a very interesting transition period of 16-bit into 32-bit where you could digitize more, or you could just plain record more of it and what comes about and what is. And so, yeah, that was definitely a fun time of like, what are you putting in the song? I don't know exactly where to put this in our conversation, but I'm now just thinking about it. Something I absolutely loved in my youth was on the PlayStation 1, since it was a CD player and all of the discs on it were technically just regular old CDs, a lot of the games themselves had their soundtracks contained within the game. And by that, I mean, if you were to take that PlayStation Black disc, put it into a CD player, skip track 1, because that is where a lot of computer data is set. And if you're not careful and if the stars align horribly for you, you'll hear a lot of speaker and ear damaging screeching noises. Dial-up modems got nothing on this. But after that, often I remember I would bring my PS1 games in one of those little binders that have all the sleeves. And I had one that had the PlayStation logo on it and everything. And I'd go up to Vermont and visit family, and our cousins had a PS1 as well. And I'd have my little Discman. So I'd take a game out, put it in, and, you put a CD into the CD player and it will, like, not start playing, but tell you how many tracks there are and how long the runtime is.
Right.
If there was more than one, well, I want to see what's going on here. Sometimes it would be the entire soundtrack, like in the case of Bust a Move 2. Or there was definitely most of the soundtrack in the Tomb Raider 2 game, and it even had certain voice clips. The soundtrack itself ended with the voice clip of Lara at the end of the game going, "Haven't you seen enough?" Gunshot. CD ends. And the game N2O, Nitrous Oxide, had its soundtrack composed by The Crystal Method. And basically, N2O is an entire Crystal Method album that I don't think appears on anything else. So there's that, if you're into that. Or very infamously, Castlevania Symphony of the Night has 2 tracks on its CD. And the second one actually opens with the voice actor explaining, "As you can see, this is a PlayStation Black disc. Cut number 1 contains computer data, so please don't listen to it. But you probably won't listen to me anyway, will you?" And it then plays a track that doesn't appear in the game. It's its own thing that most people know nowadays because that track's been sort of put everywhere. But it was very interesting, this sort of momentary crossover where soundtracks and music could do all sorts of things, and also the medium itself could literally give you the soundtrack. So you could listen to it and you don't have to download Nintendo sound file format files and something that will play it back so you can listen to the soundtrack on your computer, or leave the game on for hours so you can listen to your favorite track. And we've since moved on from there, and that's not how everything should have been forever, but it was an interesting moment.
Yeah, I had forgotten about that because I didn't really own a PS1. I owned a PS2, and I had forgotten that you could listen to those discs as music discs sometimes, which I think is really interesting and not a thing you can really do with any other type of game. I mean, with the Nintendo era, it's always been cartridges for the most part of some kind
Right.
or another. I also have to apologize, but suddenly one of my neighbors is drilling, and so if that shows up in the final cut, there's nothing I can do about it.
We can do some edits. We should be all right.
I'm sure you will, but just in case, I'm shouting it out because that guy's an asshole.
Who drills on a Sunday?
Right? Come on, it's the day of rest. Anyway, back to games and music. What's interesting now, though, about modern gaming also is that, there's always been So let's talk about the sound test, because we haven't talked about that yet.
That's true.
Something that's always been in games since the dawn of time, more or less, is this feature in the options menu where you can just play the music. And for some games, it's just there. There's not much to do with it. And then with other games like the Kirby series, it was an accomplishment to unlock all of the different stage tracks and then be able to go back and listen to them. In some games, you could actually collect CDs in the game to then unlock the music tracks. Famously in the early Smash Brothers games, you had to unlock all the music so you could listen to it. And I always thought that was something interesting that a lot of my friends didn't care about growing up, is like unlocking music as an accomplishment always was cool to me, because I would love just listening to the music in the game, like leaving it on and playing the music.
Yeah, and we've kind of come full circle in the fact that Smash Brothers Ultimate for the Switch is able to, when you unlock all the tracks, you can listen to the music on the Switch as if it was just a music player. You're not playing the game. You can just, walk about your day with headphones on, and you're listening to hundreds of tracks from games across the decades.
Yeah, it's almost something like I want to disqualify Smash Brothers Ultimate from being in our favorite gaming soundtrack conversation later, because it doesn't count, because it just has everything.
Yeah, when it's a collection, it feels it feels a little. It feels like you're cheating
a little bit. Yeah, but like you what's crazy is that it has something over like I think they said 15,000 hours of music or some nonsense like that.
It sounds about right. I remember for some reason the number 900 tracks pops into my head.
So let's go with that one. But like, that's an insane amount of music. I think they said it would take something like 3 weeks to listen to the whole thing consecutively, which is insane. That's an insane amount of music, and really cool, and something that we couldn't have done even a decade ago because there wasn't enough storage and memory. In fact, they talked about with Ultimate how they had to shift around certain things to fit all the music because they wanted to include it, and so they had to remove or shift certain things just so they could fit all the data.
It's a key part of the experience.
Well, yeah, I think playing those iconic stages with those characters, you want to hear the iconic music that those characters are known for. And it even lets you customize the soundtrack. No other fighting game that I know of lets you do that, but in Smash Bros. Ultimate, you can choose to turn off certain tracks you don't like, make other tracks happen more frequently. Hell, you could sift it down so each character's stage only plays one track, so you always hear that track. Like, they give you that customization, which I think is really awesome, especially as a music nerd, because if I want to just hear the airship theme from Super Mario Brothers 3 every time I play a Mario level, I can do that if I want.
Yeah, and most fighting games I don't think have that level of customization, because certainly in my brain, not since Street Fighter 2 has a fighting game had a soundtrack where you really had strong opinions about it.
That's true. I would say that I would agree that probably Street Fighter and Killer Instinct are the two games that I can think of off the top of my head where I really remember the music, except for like the character select screen on Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
Of course.
Because everyone remembers I'm going to take you for a ride.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I know there are other fighting games that have come out since that I just haven't put as much time in, that I'm sure people have strong opinions about the soundtrack, but Street Fighter 2.
Right. Guile's theme goes with everything. Which, speaking about video game music, that was is a meme, I guess, because it still exists, that I think is really fascinating from a music theory perspective because, well, why does it go with everything? Why does that song fit every action scene, every movie scene, every moment? And it's something about that composition that makes it really adaptable.
Something about the BPM versus what it's doing harmonically. You'll find moments for it to match up with just about anything. It may not do it perfectly, but it does it good enough. And it goes with everything. It's
a rule now of the internet.
Exactly. But also thinking on some of the older games and the idea that games had to be like sort of catchy, and it allows those simple melodies to show up elsewhere, and it allows in Smash Brothers for them to make bigger arrangements of it and for it to feel so much more epic. Are there any favorite sort of like licks or riffs or even Easter egg kind of riffs that, because this is also going back a little bit to sound test too, that you like in games that like whenever it shows up, it's like it's delightful?
I mean, I can definitely speak to certain series. Like again, I'm a Super Nintendo fanboy at heart. I think the fact that most of the Mega Man X soundtrack resembled, like heavy metal guitars and like electronica guitars and industrial guitars so much is probably what I like the most. Like the opening theme to the first non-stage of Mega Man X when you're running along the highway. Like I can hear those guitar riffs in my head. And they definitely influenced a lot of the music that I loved growing up because I liked a lot of heavy rock stuff. And that was throughout the Mega Man X series, but most prominent in the first two games. Whereas like the early Mega Man stuff, they actually dabbled in a lot of genres. Like I said, Gemini Man kind of had a kind of samba kind of feel or salsa feel, one or the other. I'm probably confusing two disparate genres, so forgive me. But like it had a flow that, and again, a lot of the other stuff was pop music influenced or very bouncy. It wasn't until Mega Man X where it got a little heavier and it had those ridiculous guitar riffs that weren't actually guitars. They were digital guitars, but they still sounded so much like the rock music that I was growing up with at the time.
Yeah, you try and tell me Zero's theme doesn't bang.
Oh my God, yeah. And now I'm hearing it in my head the minute you mentioned it. And like that's something that's really sat with me about the Mega Man series specifically and Mega Man X even more specifically is that all of those themes are so iconic. Vile's theme also on that first stage when you fight him for the first time and then fight him later, like the boss themes from that game. All of them were just so rock influenced, and it was so refreshing to me as a video game player because it was the first time I really felt like I recognized the genre in a video game. And I'm sure it's not the only one, but for me, it was one of the most iconic.
Very cool. And yeah, and those some of those tracks and some of those melodies would come back even in later games. And there's certain ones that you hear and you just go, well, it's Mega Man, and it means this, and it connects to that, and here it is.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing.
What about you? Are there any iconic instrumental moments from gaming's past that stand out to you?
Stand out to me. Well, I was even thinking on probably one of my favorite soundtracks. I was thinking of Katamari Damacy, which has a very distinct melody that shows up throughout the soundtrack, shows up throughout the all the levels, all the different stuff that's going on, and it kind of can come back in little moments here and there, and it's less of a big epic feeling and just more of this wonderfully connected, delighted feeling that comes with it. But that's not quite what we're talking about here. Let me think about well, I'll get back to why I love Katamari Damacy later, probably when we wrap up the episode and go on our favorite soundtrack tangents.
Yes.
But I would say probably Crystalis for the NES.
Okay.
It was a game that I tried to beat so many times when I was a kid. Never did. I've beaten it so many times now as an adult. But when I was a kid, it was a challenging game, and some areas music would overlap, but there were other times you'd get to places and they had completely new tracks, and all of them were fantastic, and all of them were suitably epic and adventurous or dangerous or moody. And to get to a new area, it was a very you need this item to give to this person so that they can give you this thing that lets you move on to this next area. So completing all of those and getting to the next spot and hearing what the new track was and hearing what you were doing now was so exciting every time. And even when I would start a new file, because the abusive tendencies of young boys on games or just children on games and cartridges, we would just erase files all the time. So playing through it again and then getting to an area where it's like, okay, this is getting towards as far as I've gotten. I've made it to the Angry Sea and it has its own music and oh my God, and this is exciting and let me find what's going on. It created a continuous sense of discovery and wonder. And so I guess that's the one that is a big deal for me.
Okay. It's funny because you've mentioned that game on more than one occasion on this podcast at this point. And I've still yet to play it. So I think I need to make that happen at some point. It's funny. I want to go back to talking about the adaptability of video game music a little bit because I'm remembering other memes that are coming to mind, like, the mashup of Kirby and Snoop Dogg's Drop It Like It's Hot, and how so many video game songs have been memeified in modern culture because they are rife for mashup culture, which
Yeah.
it just because there's such a great baseline that you can mix them with other things so easily. And I think that's
Yeah.
always really fascinating.
They have very elemental qualities. You're able to distill any one of these tracks down to a very like quintessential point and then infuse it into something else. And yeah, you're right. It does create a very adaptable soundscape where you can reference dozens of things within a couple of minutes. And if you do it right, it doesn't feel pandering and it just feels like you're creating something new with all the pieces. That's what sampling is all about.
Yeah, I want to shout out actually also a recent discovery. I think this popped up on the internet last year, but someone discovered as the Wii Shop was closing that the drum and bass of the Wii Shop and the tune of the Wii Shop works really well with a certain Busta Rhymes song. And so there's a YouTube video called Busta Rhymes Goes to the Wii Shop, and I really suggest you check it out. It's just really impressive for a song that's a pretty lighthearted song and not what you would consider to be a beat for a rap song. It works so well with these Busta Rhymes lyrics that it's kind of astounding.
Also, when you consider the vocal quality of Busta Rhymes versus the very light instrumentation and mood of that music, makes a nice contrast.
Yeah. Also, shout out to Jim Caddick of Caddicarus, who's been doing drum covers of some old school gaming stuff too. And he did a really cool drum cover of the Wii Shop channel as well, that I highly recommend. But it's just, what I love is, while I love video game music and I love talking about video games and talking about the music in gaming, I think it's really cool when we get to see what happens with those songs outside of the games industry too, and how people cover them or adapt them or mash them up or remix them. We've mentioned OC Remix on this podcast many times and on this episode, and I grew up loving OC Remix. I unfortunately don't go to the website as much as I used to, but back before digital music was super frequent, I used to listen to OC remixes of tons of game soundtracks all the time. In fact, on my old iPod, I still have a ton of old remixes that I loved from that website, because this was a website that allowed people to share and post their remixes of video game music for free with little to no issue.
Yeah, and it got a lot of people their start as composers or as industry professionals and others. It was just something wonderful for all of us to check out. I remember when they were, I don't know if they're still doing this, but certainly for a while they were coming out with album collections of certain games or certain characters, and they would only distribute it through BitTorrent just because of the sheer amount of downloading. And I remember BitTorrenting a whole bunch of OC Remix albums, like the Mega Man X album, the Kirby album, the Legend of Zelda. It was a bunch of them.
Yeah, some of the songs that I've mentioned today, while I remember the tunes clearly, my brain may actually be remembering the OC remixes of them because they were just so pervasive in my life. Like, I remember the opening track to Mega Man X, the remix of it being called Brain Stick Metal. I don't know if that's the actual name of the song, but in my
I don't think it is.
But that's what I want to call it because the remix was called that. And I hear those actual guitars slamming in that way that OC Remix did so well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'm just thinking of video game covers and stuff, and I forgot. I was in a band that did a video game cover. When I was in college, I was part of a very large ska band. And I mean that because even for a ska band, we had a lot of members. There were 16 of us.
Oh, wow. That is big for a ska band.
Yeah, it was an 8-piece horn section. And so I didn't have much of a hand in a lot of the composition or anything. And when I got there, they were already doing this cover. So I learned my part and off we went. We did a cover of Casino Night Zone.
That's a good one.
And we turned it into basically a jazz song. I mean, it's a jazzy song, but what I mean is we would play the main melody of it, and then we would all take turns doing a 16-bar improv on it. And then we'd come back to it and do the head one more time, and that was what we did. And so it was kind of fun to it wasn't quite a remix or anything like that, but it was definitely a fun time of taking it out of context, just doing something fun, seeing the recognition for everybody, and then doing that jazz self-pleasing of let me improv on it, man, then come back to it. You can take these songs into a lot of different directions.
Yeah, I think also what's really fascinating about the games industry as a whole, as we continue to do this podcast, is that I always think, like the music industry, I have a handle on everything and I know a lot of what there is to know. And then I ask a question about what someone's favorite this or that is, and then find out I actually know nothing. I know almost nothing, because I hear people talk about games and soundtracks and music that I've never heard of, that then of course I want to play or hear. And you kind of forget the longevity and the size of this industry until you engage with that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah. And there are even times where, even in your own history, you forget these things. You focus on one soundtrack, or you focus on one series or one experience, and then someone says something or brings something up that reminds you, oh my God, I played that all the time. I know all of that. I haven't thought about that in years. Why is the entire soundtrack popping into my head now?
Right, exactly.
So it's great to engage with people and sort of spark that for them and have them spark it in you, and set you out to try out new experiences.
Before we start to bring this episode to a close and talk about some of our favorites, I wanted to shout out, I asked a question on our Facebook page of what other people's favorite video game soundtracks are, and I just want to give a shout out to the people who responded with some of their favorites and list them here. Stuff that I'm actually not completely familiar with. Some that I am and some that I'm not. So we'll start with America Line, who's a burlesque performer who's actually named America Online at AOL.com, I believe is her full name, mentions Jet Set Radio Future, which is a game that I loved that I probably haven't played in ages, that I know
Same.
had an incredible soundtrack. If you were into the Tony Hawk and skateboarding games of that age, Jet Set Radio Future kind of took it to the next level.
Yeah. And it's a game that's all about the music without being a music game.
Michael Drake gave us 4, technically 5 of his favorites: Metroid Prime and Echoes, Metal Gear for the NES, Simon's Quest, and Dracula's Curse.
Excellent.
So Dracula's Curse, I mean, I remember Castlevania 3 having some incredible music for a game that I remember only sort of liking, because of course it was just stupidly difficult. I remember the whole Castlevania series has had incredible music, but I remember specifically Castlevania 3 having some of the better songs of the early part of the series.
It has some spectacular tracks.
Noah DeMario mentions Risk of Rain, which is actually not a game I'm familiar with.
Same. I've heard of it.
But definitely I'll want to go check it out now that you've mentioned it, because I have gotten into games by hearing songs from the games first and going, oh, I want to see what that goes with, and then going checking out the game.
It's one of the main reasons I want to play Persona 5.
Yeah, Persona 5 is a pretty incredible great game, though I haven't finished it yet because it's just a very involved game. The music is really, really good.
Mm-hmm.
Our very own MJ Bradley Lestrange mentions Skies of Arcadia, which of course is a game that I loved. If you've not played Skies of Arcadia, it is an incredible action RPG that was first on the Dreamcast, that was later re-released on the GameCube, that all of gaming is crying out for them to re-release again anywhere else, but has not happened yet.
Yeah.
I'm going to skip mine, as I will talk about that later. Benjamin Smith says, objectively, the Witcher 3 soundtrack, and nostalgia-wise, he loves the orchestrated versions of Final Fantasy IV. We have not talked a lot about Final Fantasy on this podcast, but of course, what's the composer's name? Is it
Nobuo Uematsu?
That is it. Who did a majority of especially all of the early Final Fantasy games.
He worked on Chrono Trigger. He worked on a bunch of things, and it's also the fact that I almost feel like, were we ignoring him this episode? I don't know. It almost just feels like everyone has at least one favorite Final Fantasy track.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I feel like that's true. And I don't know that we ignored him so much as, I know I didn't bring up Chrono Trigger yet because I have stuff to say on that later. But
here.
The Final Fantasy VII soundtrack is one of the first CD soundtracks I bought, besides one other.
Nice.
That I listened to all the time because, again, there was so much genre mixing in that soundtrack, like how heavy metal that frickin' battle theme is. And of course, the Black Mages, which is his band, that is a metal band that does Final Fantasy music. Like, it all wraps around.
It's sort of that, like, assumed. And of course, Final Fantasy has amazing soundtracks. I went to the Distant Worlds concert last year, and it was a religious experience.
Oh, I'm sure it was. Robert Brown mentions Tron, which, I mean, the movie is a video game, but also there was a Tron video game, several Tron video games. So that's a good shout out as well. Also, I do like that in Kingdom Hearts, they do, I believe, use some of the Tron music in the Kingdom Hearts Tron world.
I think they do, yeah.
Our good friend Baron Anime mentions Xenogears, which, of course, is one of the more infamous PlayStation games that had incredible visuals and an incredible soundtrack.
It was a wonderful, ambitious title that just could not achieve what it wanted to.
And then, of course, he mentioned Skyrim and Disgaea and the Persona series as well, which we had talked about before.
Disgaea, yeah.
And Skyrim's one of those games where, like, yes, it's a Skyrim. It's an Elder Scrolls game. It has great music, great atmosphere. Next, but not to knock it, because it is incredible. But, like, the music, that's one of those games where the music is so good because you don't always notice it, and it does fit a mood.
Mm-hmm. It enhances the whole experience.
John Bradley Lestrange mentions Tony Hawk, a Pro Skater 3, which I knew someone was going to mention that, because the Tony Hawk games had such a great collection of punk and rock music that you couldn't really hear in video games at the time, except on games that licensed it like those.
Yeah. And it was and again, that's back to that whole PS1 thing with, like, the CD sound. And it also popularized a lot of skate culture, which was tied in with punk and ska. And there was a lot of, like, back and forth that went on with that, and it created this very interesting era. And, there's a generation of people who know all kinds of, like, underground punk songs, but only the ones on the Tony Hawk soundtrack.
Justin Nozek mentions, by the way, Justin, I'm sorry if I butchered your last name. Forgive me.
We're sorry.
Mentions the opening theme to Solstice, which I'm not even familiar with.
Solstice.
I did listen to the track that he posted. He posted the title theme on our Facebook post, but I never played that game. The music was gorgeous, though.
Wasn't that an NES game?
It was an NES game.
Okay. I've never played it. Just you said it, and I'm like, my brain's going, what is that? What does that look like? Oh, it's an NES game.
David Boyle, creator of the logo for Reignite, he said that the first thing that popped into his head was Katamari Damacy, which you mentioned earlier, or Katamari Damacy, however it's pronounced.
Damacy.
And then finally, Michael Kill mentions the alleged Michael Kill I mentioned earlier, who created the song The Moon, mentioned the Oblivion soundtrack, which I know he's been obsessed with the game Oblivion for ages. And Oblivion, I would say, is still my favorite of the Elder Scrolls games. Skyrim I've put the most hours into, but I feel like Oblivion had the best music, atmosphere, storytelling. Like, if they re-released Oblivion in HD, I'd probably buy it.
You wouldn't be alone.
Because it was, I think, one of the best coalescence of everything that Bethesda does in a game.
Yeah, that sounds right.
We also had some replies on our Twitter account as well, besides me and Geoff, which, again, we'll get into that in a bit. But Chris Lance Lee, actor friend of mine, mentioned Grabbed by the Ghoulies, which was by Grant Kirkhope we talked about earlier, which is definitely one of those games that without its frenetic soundtrack wouldn't be, I feel like, as much of a fun game without that soundtrack.
Yeah. And
then, of course, our very own old Ben over at Certain POV Podcast mentions the Warcraft soundtrack, which, I would say that while the World of Warcraft soundtrack is hit or miss for me, definitely the first 3 Warcraft games definitely had incredibly energetic and awesome soundtracks, and they had to, because they were RTSs. Like, it was kind of necessary.
Yeah, they're very engrossing.
Now, that said, there is a ton of music I love in the World of Warcraft series. I just feel like it's a game that's been around for so long, and there's been so much music that some of it doesn't always hit with me. But for sure, the main themes and, like, the themes for Stormwind and Ironforge and all the major cities, when you enter those cities, those feel epic and larger than life, which is the point,
Yeah, no, it's true. And sometimes these songs don't necessarily need to be like completely, unquestionably epic and amazing, because sometimes they become, as we've been talking about, part of the identity of the game. Thinking of MMOs, I'm reminded of EverQuest. And the fact that I was describing it actually a few days ago to somebody. I was talking about like quests and places, and it occurred to me, just as I'm saying it out loud to people who never played the game, but were like, oh yeah, I know, I read about it, I like definitely, but it is so cliche. So many of the zone names are on the nose. You deal with the Crushbone Orcs and it's Emperor Crush. And the loading music as it loads up the character select screen is MIDI as hell. Like, this is epic adventure-y kind of. I've gone back and played EverQuest every now and again, and when that theme pops up, you're transported, you're there. It's welcome to Norath, welcome to this completely like bizarre cliche storm of a game that you love. So it's just as much as music can enhance a game, it can also reinforce its identity.
For sure. Yeah. I want to thank everyone who, by the way, did answer our question on
Yes.
Twitter and Facebook. We love interacting with you guys. That's why I wanted to give you all a shout out on this podcast. I realize I say guys, but I mean everybody, guys, girls, non-binary. It's a thing I say. I'm trying to break that habit.
You digital scape friends you.
Yes,
thank you.
Exactly. And before we move on to our favorites, I did want to mention something that I forgot to mention, which was when video games use actual music from our real world in their games. And a company that has done it more than anyone else that I can think of is Gearbox and Borderlands. The first Borderlands used a song by Cage the Elephant for their opening cinematic, and then for their second game they used Shortchange Hero, a song that I still love to this day because of that game. And so with the announcement of Borderlands 3, I'm very excited to see what new band I become obsessed with because they use one of their songs in the opening cinematic.
Yeah.
I always think it's a fascinating thing when you do that. Also, their trailers, like the trailer for Borderlands 2, used a song by the DJ Nero for like this dubstep nonsense that they used for that trailer, which was so awesome and energizing. And I love that song to this day because of that trailer. I think it's always interesting when designers and creators show their hand by using pop culture music or modern music in the game itself, and besides just composing music for the game.
I feel like our next episode should just be about licensed music in games.
Yeah, I think so too, especially considering, we haven't even talked about any of the rhythm games and how they thrived on existing music to make their soundtracks, and how I used to make mix CDs. Yes, mix CDs.
Oh, I still make mix CDs. There's no shame here.
Of the music that was featured in Rock Band, because there were songs that I got in Rock Band that I didn't know before that game that I then wanted to listen to outside of playing the game.
There you go.
But yeah, I think we have hit a good point where, Geoff, it is time to disclose some of our favorite video game soundtracks.
Yes, those secrets that people who follow our Twitter already know.
Right,
and
exactly.
we kind of talked about anyway.
But we can go a little more in depth into why we love those soundtracks.
Oh, yeah. And the two that I listed were Katamari Damacy and Final Fantasy VII. Now, that also kind of goes back to my brain going, I feel like everybody has a favorite Final Fantasy soundtrack.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, that may in fact be my favorite is this Final Fantasy soundtrack and this other one. Because I don't just want to say Final Fantasy VII or,
Right.
or whatever it is, but you still love it. Final Fantasy VII was a excessively formative game for me. It was on the PS1, which was the first system that was mine in the house, or one that I had as unlimited access to as a child could have to a video game console. It was it was the game that it was. It was this huge cinematic, oh my God, crazy town thing. And the music was just spectacular. I remember playing the demo off of Tobal number 1 so many times. So I heard Bombing Mission, the first track for the for the opening of the game, so many times, and I've heard it so many times since. Still haven't gotten tired of it. It is such a large and varied soundtrack, and it's one that I can't think of a weak link in it. So much of it either fills in the space of, okay, this tells you a lot about where you are. This tells you a lot about this character. This is going to be connected to emotional moments you will not be able to let go of for years. And it was, it's not a perfect game, but it's close to a perfect soundtrack, in my opinion. Certainly in terms of, does it suit the game? Does it enhance the game? Does it make it the experience that it is? Yes. And Katamari Damacy is a game that, again, it certainly didn't limit itself in its production quality, but it had a lot of motific ideas to it. And it was also one that very much set the mood of the game. It is a ridiculous game. And I've come to realize recently that not people either absolutely know what Katamari Damacy is or they have no idea. I recently got the Fangamer came out with an enamel pin of the Prince, and it has a Katamari that you can spin, which has been
cute.
great. It is so adorable. I love it. I love it to tears. And when other people recognize it, it's such a wonderful conversation starter. But Katamari Damacy is a game where you are the prince of all cosmos and your father, the king of all cosmos, one night, probably drunk, you infer from the dialogue, destroyed all the stars in the sky and puts it to you to rebuild them. And so you get a little ball called a Katamari that anything smaller than it will stick to it. And by getting those things stuck to the ball, makes the ball bigger. And by making the ball bigger, you can roll up other things that are now smaller than this ball. So you can start off the size of a thumbtack and then end up rolling the entire house up all at once. It's a weird, wacky, fun game. And the soundtrack suits that. And there's even like beautiful songs within it, but it has it is at times almost making a finger mustache epic serious. We must stand up very straight and be this. And other times it is very relaxed and free and breezy. You're fighting against a time limit to roll up these stars, but it never gets panicky. And throughout, as little motifs and melodies pop up, it creates this beautiful, unified identity. There have been sequels to Katamari Damacy, and I do enjoy those, but there is something about the original game that is this beautiful encapsulated experience where Final Fantasy VII is tens of hours. You can beat the original Katamari in a weekend. And it has a full start to finish great experience. And the soundtrack is a huge part of that. Also, the tune is so very hummable to the point where the title screen is actually the composer humming the music. That is all it is. And that apparently came from when he was walking around the offices composing and humming into a tape recorder. And they went, well, that's perfect. Put that up. And so when you start the game up, that is what you hear. It's a white screen. You pick your file. You roll the Katamari to roll up the Namco logo to pick your file. And you just have a guy singing a song. And then immediately after that, it gets huge and bombastic and ridiculous. And that is Katamari Damacy. And that's why it's probably my favorite soundtrack.
It's funny, you mentioned humming the theme, and I can't help but remember in the original Luigi's Mansion when you were in the unlit corridors, sometimes there was no music. So instead, Luigi would hum the main theme of the game instead of the main theme playing.
Yeah.
And I always love that little bit of sound design. But also, real quick, an additional shout out. You mentioned Final Fantasy VII, which is one of my favorites, but not at the top of my list. Back in 2011, Mega Ran, of course, did a whole album dedicated to Final Fantasy VII, where he raps over music from that game as well, which I highly recommend. It's called Black Materia Final Fantasy VII. It is a phenomenal rap soundtrack, and if you love Final Fantasy, it's phenomenal in its own right, but if you love Final Fantasy VII, you'll love it even more. So I highly recommend that. So you're right. My two favorite video game soundtracks are a game series and my favorite Final Fantasy game, which is Chrono Trigger. It's the best Final Fantasy game. At me. Come after me. I'll take it. But Chrono Trigger is one of the first CD soundtracks I ever owned for a video game. I believe it's 2 or 3 discs. And I love that game. I love that soundtrack. What I love about that soundtrack is not only does it have great music for all of the locales that you're in, but every character has their own theme. And in other games, that's the case too. But Chrono Trigger is one of the first games where I really remembered and loved every single character's theme. You think about the sweeping score that is Frog's theme versus the kind of poppy techno sound of Robo's theme. There's just such diversity in that soundtrack for something that was on the Super Nintendo and had such limitations. They did such great work with it. And all of the main themes, even when you first get the Epoch and you're first traveling through time, to Lavos' theme, like all of these songs are so memorable and so impactful, and the game would not be anywhere near as good, I think, without that incredible soundtrack, because you can only get so far on good storytelling and mechanics alone.
Yeah, and when your main character doesn't say anything, has no dialogue whatsoever, music can speak volumes, even more than usual.
And even that scene where, so here's a spoiler alert for a very old game that if you've not played Chrono Trigger, skip 5 minutes, I guess. But it's one of the only games that I know of where your main character can die and you can get him back, but you don't have to get him back.
He's a side quest.
He's a side quest to bring him back to life, and you don't have to. But if you do, and, no matter who his focus is, whether it's his best friend Luca or his love Marley, the scene where he's resurrected in front of the tree, and it's just the tree with a black background and whoever is there with him, the somber music that plays as you rekindle this life and bring back this friendship or love or more is so beautiful. And the moment is even more beautiful because of the music that's playing at the time.
Mm-hmm. It makes a mood.
Yeah.
It creates a hell of a memory. I mean, the end of Disc 1 of Final Fantasy VII, the fact that the music that plays at the end plays throughout the boss fight that follows before there is a full denouement on it is heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's rough. The Final Fantasy, I think, is a series that's always known how to set a mood with music, and I've always loved that about it.
Yeah.
But my favorite gaming soundtrack of modern gaming probably has to be, I would generally say the whole Mass Effect series, but more specifically Mass Effect 2. Because Mass Effect 2, what's really interesting about the Mass Effect series as far as its music is none of it is music that I would rock out to in the same way I rocked out to old 16-bit music. But it is very much the closest thing we will ever get to an original IP that resembles Star Wars in video games. Because Mass Effect sets a mood, the composition and main themes are reprised throughout the game, and some of the most insane moments happen with the music and then the absence of music. We're just covering the beginnings of the second game on Reignite, and some of even the early... There's an early battle moment that happens that I'll try and avoid spoilers with, where you're attacked by a giant ship, and the heavy drum music that hits really gives a sense of dread instantly, that even if you weren't sure what was going on, when that music kicks in, you can feel your heart sink because you get this sense of dread just from the soundtrack.
Nice.
Yeah, I highly recommend if you're someone who has not played Mass Effect or who is starting to, that you also go out of your way to listen to the soundtracks outside of the game, because they just are so expertly composed and create a strong narrative even without the game present, which is what makes that music, I think, so powerful.
Nice. Very cool.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. It's why I also think that Dan Bull's Mass Effect rap, which we use as our theme for Reignite, it does sample music from the game. I think also, like other great soundtracks, is good to be built upon, and is one of also the reasons I love that soundtrack, is because it reminds me of old school stuff while still being sweeping and epic like a lot of modern gaming.
Very nice. Very fantastic.
So that's music and video games. We've covered it all. We never have to talk about it again.
Well, we'd still like to hear from all of you about music and video games. What are some of your favorite musical moments in games, whether it's the opera sequence from Final Fantasy VI, whether it was the first time you heard the title music of what became your favorite game of all time, What are your favorite soundtracks? What are your favorite songs? Who are your favorite composers? Have you found all of Toto KK's songs in all of the games he was a sound designer for? Look that one up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, those 17 notes. Just anything and everything. We love talking about video games, and even more than that, we love talking about video game music.
Yeah.
So
this is definitely a conversation we will return to in the future. There's always more to be said. I think we could even dive deeper into some of the music that we've loved, that maybe we've loved beyond the game or in spite of a game. Like, there's so much to talk about here. We appreciate all of you being involved in the conversation online. If you're a listener who hasn't interacted on social media but would love to now tell us your favorites, please do. We would love to hear that.
yes, please come at us with them. We want this.
Yeah, we want this. And yeah, if you want to get into a Twitter war with me about how Chrono Trigger is not the best game ever, you're allowed to be wrong, but I'll have that fun. I can't believe we've done 50 episodes. I love doing this show so much with you, Geoff, and
Likewise.
it was important to me for us to be prepared to talk about this subject, and I realized that there's still so much more to say.
So much more.
And we will definitely revisit it. But also, thank you, listener, for being with us for 50 episodes. We hope to do 50 more and beyond. It's been a blast doing this, and we want to create more. We want to interact more. Please get at us anywhere on the social media. Like, subscribe, write a review. It helps us get featured, and we can bring more people into this glorious conversation that we love to have about video games.
Yes, thank you so much for all the conversations we've had so far. I'm looking forward to all the conversations we're going to have in the future. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.